A recent CBS News poll from earlier this month found 70% of Americans think the Supreme Court should rule colleges cannot consider race in admissions. Another poll by the Pew Research Center found 50% of U.S. adults say they disapprove of selective colleges and universities taking race and ethnicity into account in order to increase diversity at the school. Now, keep in mind, Michigan is largely unaffected by the court's decision. Voters in the state already passed a ban on affirmative action in 2006. Joining us now to discuss the ruling is Detroit School Board member Sherry Gay-Dagnogo, as well as conservative political strategist Jason Cabel Roe. Thank you both for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me on.
So, Sherry, let's begin with you. What is your reaction to the Supreme Court ruling today?
So, Michigan has proven that we have been able to survive since 2006 with the striking down of affirmative action. But at the federal level, this speaks to the ongoing polarization of race in this country. If you look at the data, and Columbia law professor, in fact, Kimberly Crenshaw, noted in the U of M Law Review years ago, 2006, I believe it was, that white women are by far the largest demographic to benefit from affirmative action. And so what we have when you hear the reaction of people saying that you shouldn't use race, it never really served at scale at its intent to equalize access to education from those who have been disenfranchised in this country. And so the benefactors have been white women. That's what the data shows. So I think we need to move forward in looking at ways that we highlight these truths and then make sure that we do advance policies like reparations to ensure equal access to education for all people in this country.
Jason, what is your reaction to seeing the ruling today and what Sherry's saying as well?
Well, I don't think it's a surprise. I mean, we know what public opinion is. We know when it's been on the ballot in places like Michigan in 2006 and in California in 1996, it passed with overwhelming support. You know, I think like so many things when we have discussions about race in America today, it gets conflated with socioeconomic factors. And so I think when you look at what's happening and the lack of access to non-white students to getting into schools, it's not necessarily because of the color of their skin, but because of socioeconomic factors that sometimes they are overrepresented in those categories. And so I think if we moved from a race-based system and one that focused on the socioeconomic, I think we can still catch those Black and Latino students that are not getting access to higher education that should have those opportunities. But that should be based on need and academic criteria, not on the color of skin.
Sherry, for those who may say, look, at the end of the day, shouldn't life come down to, whether it's college admissions or getting a job, shouldn't it come down to what you do, not what you per se look like?
Well, certainly, and I have to agree with you that we do have to take into affect the impact of poverty. And we know what the impact of poverty has been. Certainly, we still have separate and unequal schools in this country 55 plus years after Brown versus the Board of Education. We know that that is a systemic, has systemic impact on the ability for African-American children and Latina children to matriculate into higher education at scale. But I don't see the same level of dissent when we see children who come from families of wealth that have demonstrated entitlements and being able to enroll in their parents' colleges and universities. And so, yes, we do have to address it, but we still have to be able to have an honest conversation around the impact of poverty, true, but also the barriers that exist at a systemic level against people of color, and more specifically, African Americans.
Jason, how will this affect colleges and universities nationwide?
Well, I have a feeling that a whole bunch of admissions officers whose job were to enforce these policies within the universities are going to be on the unemployment line, possibly. Less administrators in colleges might be a good thing for the delivery of education in our schools. Listen, I don't think it's going to be that painful a change in how they conduct their business. I mean, this is for them. It's a trimming of their sails and just doing things a little bit different. But I do think that there has to be some examination in how do we create a system that is fair? How do you develop something that looks at the socioeconomic factors? And I think, to the points made, Barack Obama's daughters would have preferential treatment going into college today over, say, the first generation child of a Vietnamese immigrant based on skin color, not on merit. And so, we could talk about the different groups that are affected and how they're affected, but we're pulling out this one characteristic and using it. And I think if you watch the president's comments today, he said very early in his statement that these universities have all of these academic criteria that everyone must meet, and then if everything is equal, you take a race into account. Look at Harvard University, which is one of the two schools talked about in this situation. Today, if you are black and you're in the 7th academic grouping for admissions, you have a better chance of getting in than an Asian student in that first grouping of students eligible to get in. And if you're within that 7th group and you're Asian, a black student is 14 times more likely than the Asian student in that same grouping to get in. So clearly race is far more of a factor than all things are being equal, and this is just one factor that's being considered.
So Sherry, do you feel as if this is leveling the playing field by any means here? Obviously, it's not having a major impact here in Michigan at schools like Michigan State and the University of Michigan, but do you feel like it levels the playing field a little bit for others that have been, potentially held back?
Well, again, the numbers speak for themselves. I think that there is certainly value to that conversation. I don't want to just specifically say that I want all students, African American or Latina, to surpass those who have greater academic standing, but we have to look at the larger construct of the contributions that have been made to this country, the barriers that have been put in place in the African-American community for students to, number one, get a quality education at the K-12 level and then to matriculate into higher education. I think we have to rethink policy as a country. And I think Harvard was striving to work in a way to diversify its population because, listen, those that come from wealthy backgrounds or whose parents have attended universities, anytime you continue to separate students from being able to interact together, we all lose. And so we have to have a more diverse playing field with respect to students coming together and learning from each other. And I think that's what's missing at many of our Ivy League universities, and that was the goal that they were trying to achieve. Should it be done just on skin color alone? No, but the numbers again say those who benefited the most were white women. So we now need to look at poverty. I think that would be the greatest equalizer to address that so that we now create an opportunity to increase the pipeline for higher education for those students who have been impacted by poverty, especially systematically.
And there is something to be said for diversity and the social benefits of that, going to school at a diverse university and being a part of a diverse community. There are the social benefits to that.
Well, I will tell you right now, I have a 13-year-old, and so in 5 years, he's got to make a decision about college. And I'm, always thought that that would be my expectation for my son, and I don't feel as strongly about that as I once did. And the only reason that I do feel strongly anymore is because I want that exposure to other people, to other places, to different culture that you don't necessarily get when you live in the same place for a period of time and you're surrounded by the same circle of people. And so I see it more, I've jokingly told my kid if he graduates with a 2.5, it's great as long as you go and get that exposure. I think another, talking about white women being disproportionately the beneficiaries, when you look at college admissions today, 60% of college students today are women. It is that much of a disparity that you now have a 20% gap within higher education between men and women. And maybe that's a byproduct in some ways of what we're talking about here today. But I also think what's happening in universities and how men are feeling when they're at universities in today's world, I think also makes it a little more uncomfortable. And you have vocational opportunities that men often have maybe a little better advantage at securing than women do.
When you talk about what we've been dealing with here in Michigan, and this largely does not affect us here per se, how do you think this state and the universities and colleges in this state have handled this since that ruling in 2005?
Well, I think we still have a lot of work to do. The numbers highlighting, even So the first time that affirmative action was mentioned, the National Labor Act in 1935. And so if we look at the numbers that are even reflective in the workforce, which is, our colleges and university are a microcosm of what is in the workforce. And again, we still see those numbers that are trending in a way that are very polarizing. You don't see a true coming together of a diversified workforce. And you're right, women are leading, and at scale, white women are leading at 3 times the rate of African American women when you talk about the C-suites, corporate suites, et cetera. So our universities locally, I think that we still need to do more work to address diversifying and creating opportunity for all of our students to enter our universities, and not just our universities, skilled trades, but certainly higher education, creating those opportunities and those pathways for children that are coming from communities that have been impacted grossly by poverty.
And let me make a correction. It was 2006, not
Yes.
2005.
Right.
So let me make that correction. Well, thank you both so much for being here tonight. We appreciate the insight on this Supreme Court ruling. Detroit School member Sherry Gay-Dagnogo, as well as Jason Cabel Roe. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
After the break, we will have the very latest from the Rocket Mortgage Classic when we come back.